coexistence in itself, which is embedded culturally, is actually a story of hope for tiger conservation in India.
Hello, everyone. I am Dilpreet. I welcome you to Nature Speaks, a WWF-India podcast where we explore stories behind conservation, people working to protect a natural world. Today is a special episode where we will be talking about India's most iconic species, that is the tiger. We know India is home to about 70% of the world's wild tigers that are widely distributed across the country. And this remarkable achievement has been possible due to decades of commitment from the governments, forest departments, organizations, local communities, and of course, scientists and frontline forest staff. Clearly, India has become a global conservation success story with its tiger population doubling. But if you look beyond the headlines, you will find that this isn't just a story about saving a single species, it's about restoring habitats, it is about recovering prey populations, reconnecting fragmented forests, and finding ways for people and wildlife to coexist in shared landscapes. As tiger populations recover and they expand, there are new opportunities, but there are also new challenges. How do tigers move safely between forests? Why are wildlife corridors so critical for their long term survival? How do we reduce human wildlife conflict while also supporting the communities? And what does it really mean? What does tiger conservation really mean to the health of the entire ecosystem? So, these are some of the questions we will be exploring today with an incredible all women panel of experts, each bringing a very unique perspective to tiger conservation story. Joining me is Deepthi Gupta, who works on tiger conservation in the WWF India Central India landscape, focusing on wildlife monitoring, prey recovery, understanding threats, and the science that informs conservation practices. We are also joined by Meghna Natesh, who works on landscape connectivity and conservation genetics, helping us understand why connected habitats are essential for healthy and resilient tiger populations. And finally, Shreya Sethi, who works on human wildlife coexistence and ecosystem services, looking at how conservation can support both biodiversity and communities that share spaces. So, welcome everyone. It's really wonderful to have you all here. I want to begin with asking a question to Deepthi. When we hear about India's tiger population doubling, it's definitely a conservation success that's celebrated. But what is the story behind these numbers? What are the different pieces that come together to make this possible?
Yes, so um, yes, Dilpreet, as you said, tiger numbers have doubled in our country, and this is truly a conservation success, especially in the country that is so densely populated and rapidly developing. However, this recovery is not evenly spread across the country. While maybe tiger reserves number have increased over the past decade, the number of tigers in all of the tiger reserves have not increased as as we see today or as we see the output today. So if I give you some numbers, approximately 40% of India's tiger population is residing in some 11% of tiger reserves. And if we look at the time, that doubling of tiger number that we see today is because of some of the tiger reserves, broadly speaking, some 8 tiger reserves. And what might have actually driven the tiger recovery could be habitat management, prey recovery, and the protection enforcement that has been taken place in last decade. So when tiger population is low, reintroduction is not the only pathway to recovery. Um, some of the tiger reserves have recovered their number through natural dispersal. So I'm working in central India, and um, I'm also working in Achanakmar Tiger Reserve, where tiger numbers have recovered through natural dispersal. some of the factors that are very crucial to tiger recovery, which is prey recovery, habitat management, um, protection enforcement, also to maintain the functional connectivity so that tigers can actually explore neighboring areas and then they can disperse to some of the other neighboring populations.
Thanks, Deepthi. That was a very useful insight, and clearly, tiger conservation is not just about doubling tigers, but I think there's a much larger picture. There are different pieces to it in terms of, habitat management, like you said, wildlife monitoring, use of science, policy, and of course, the important role the communities play. So that brings us to another very crucial and sometimes overlooked aspect of conservation story, which is about wildlife connectivity. So I would like to ask Meghna, why is landscape connectivity so critical for the long-term future of tiger populations?
Uh, Thanks, Dilpreet. Some populations may have gone locally extinct. If recovery has to happen, then individuals have to be able to disperse into these areas where extinction has happened. But essentially, tigers are large carnivores and as such require large spaces to be able to roam. It is part of their natural behavior to leave their natal areas or where they're born and disperse outside to find new territories, look for resources, food, for mating purposes, for all of this, and establish territories slightly away from where they're born. So this requires naturally for them to be able to move, but protected areas are often small, and to be able to reach another protected area, which is typically where other breeding populations are, they need to traverse outside of protected areas to reach another population. And to be able to navigate this space, they often come outside of protected areas, which are mixed use landscapes. So it could be not just forest, but also agriculture or any other land use type that they have to navigate through. And if connectivity is severed between populations, if it has become sort of unusable for tigers, or they're unable to move through this landscape, then over time, what would happen is that populations will become isolated, and in small and isolated populations, individuals will tend to mate with each other in these small groups. So they're essentially mating with highly related individuals. And that will then lower their genetic diversity and bring down their long-term survival overall.
Thanks, Meghna. I think that's a very good insight into this whole issue, and clearly explains, why connected landscapes are so essential for allowing tigers to move safely beyond protected areas. But connectivity is just not about where tigers can go. It also is about what this movement means for the future of the species. So that brings us to another very fascinating and, in fact, evolving aspect of conservation, that is the role of genetics. So, Meghna, I'd like to ask you another question. How does genetics really influence the long term health of tiger populations?
Genetic diversity is really important for all species. It is something that allows them to be resilient in terms of, sudden changes in environment, or respond to environmental change, essentially. And one way to maintain this genetic variation within populations is if individuals are able to move from one population to another. So exchanging of individuals between populations allows them to exchange genetic material. And when populations become small and isolated particularly, this diversity starts going down because essentially you end up meeting with related individuals, as we discussed. And we know from examples, even in the wild, of cases where there have been extreme instances of, inbred populations where you can already see consequences in their health and their ability to respond to challenges. So, for example, in some populations of African cheetahs, in the Isle Royal wolves, where there are deformities, kinked tails, and so on, or ability to resist diseases, which is again reduced because there isn't enough genetic diversity to fight these diseases. In India, we know of some populations where genetic diversity is low, and possibly because of historical bottlenecks So these are challenges to keep in mind while thinking about natural recovery. And of course, as Deepti said, there have been instances where animals have been moved across.
Thanks, Meghna. So, we've talked about how connectivity not only enables tigers to move across landscapes, but it also helps maintain genetic health and long term resilience of their populations. But successful conservation also brings new realities. As the tiger populations recover, they disperse and they occupy new areas. They increasingly share spaces with people which live around these landscapes. So, therefore, coexistence becomes an integral part of the conservation story. So, a question for you, Shreya, drawing on your experience of working on human wildlife coexistence, how do we navigate this reality of people and tigers living together, living coexisting, sharing the same landscapes?
So, of course, it's a challenging and a complex aspect because, of course, with tiger recovery and people, you have to manage both sides of the situations. Looking at tiger conservation, in a sense, corridors, and the people who have to deal with these tigers in their backyard. But if we look at the history of India, coexistence is sort of embedded in our cultures. It's always been there. If we look at India as a country as a whole, it is one of the most populous countries in the world. And we still host the highest densities of tigers, leopards, elephants, all together living with these people. It's not the case that these animals are living in some isolation or in some protected areas alone. And already Deepti and Meghna have alluded to the fact of how they're moving between these areas. We can't fence them and keep these species in just protected areas. Hence, it is important to bring in the aspects of, conservation and how people can manage with it. Now, when we talk about coexistence, it's also not such a beautiful, rosy image of saying that there's never going to be any conflict. Coexistence is also where there are benign interactions between wild animals and people, which is just, the animals naturally will not prey upon humans or, cause any damage on purpose. It's usually accidental and unfortunate incidents that actually lead to conflict in a lot of scenarios. Speaking in terms of how tolerance was also something that communities have built over a period of time, and it can run on a spectrum of sometimes where communities just have had enough and they will retaliate and they are just facing so many challenges with no solutions in sight. There's nobody hearing them out when it becomes more, ugly in that sense. While on the other spectrum, there are people who have sort of taken it, internalized the whole thing and said that, it's an animal. It has its own needs like us. It needs food, water, shelter, space to live. So, we have to share those resources with them as well. And that's okay to do that. So that's one of the ways in which we see coexistence embedded in culture dominantly.
That's very rightly said, Shreya. And of course, local communities, I think, play a huge role when it comes to strengthening human wildlife coexistence. And of course, we've heard so many stories about our Bagh Mitras. If you can, share your thoughts on the Bagh Mitras that are working to, prevent human wildlife conflict.
So, particularly the community volunteers, as you said, Dilpreet, make the most fundamental and the building block of coexistence in a way. Bagh Mitra program, WWF India in collaboration with the Forest Department was a program that initiated way back in 2018. And the idea behind the program was that to recruit community volunteers who came out themselves to support conservation and to support the Forest Department and their own fellow uh, community members in managing conflict. The role of Bagh Mitras is usually very simple. It's just basically informing the people at the right time when an animal is seen near a human habitation, right? Informing the forest department if an action can be taken to prevent conflict, basically. So it's a step towards that. It's been a stepping stone, and we've been learning and evolving. The program has evolved much more, and now being able to provide more support to community members as well. But preliminary and the most fundamental role is just bridging the communication gap between the community members and the forest department and ensuring an action is taken on time.
Thanks, Shreya. So basically, we've spoken about habitats. We have spoken about genetics, role of communities, strengthening wildlife coexistence and ecosystems. So, I mean, clearly, there's one thing that comes across from this conversation is that tiger conservation is one of the most, I think, multidisciplinary conservation stories in the country. So, I have one last question for for all of you. If there is one thing you wish people understood about tiger conservation, which is beyond the headlines, what would it be?
The need of the hour is slightly different now. I suppose the conversations around conservation are slightly shifting away from being PA centric. She also brought up the fact that a lot of tigers live outside protected areas and so on, and that it's not an even success story. And I think one of the things which you also said is tracking numbers alone doesn't tell the whole picture. So it is important to think about, connected landscapes. And at the same time, while this is a tiger focused conversation, I'd also like to mention that connected landscapes, if that is the goal, we should also be thinking about species that, occupy other kinds of landscapes like open habitat species, which often get neglected when we think about forest conservation and PA focused conservation. I suppose I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Meghnada. That's a very valid point. And now I'll request Shreya if she can also share some thoughts on this question.
It's also understanding for years communities have lived in areas very close to tiger habitats in these forests, living with these wild animals. It's also now that the idea of moving away from being highlight spaces to looking at how communities themselves can manage these forests and wildlife can thrive in these forests. And both of it can happen simultaneously. So, I mean, coexistence in itself, which is embedded culturally, is actually a story of hope for tiger conservation in India.
Thanks, Shreya. I think thank you everyone for sharing these wonderful insights and reminding us that the story of India's tigers is not about a single species making a comeback. It's about forests that sustain them. It's about the landscapes that connect these forests, the science that guides conservation, and of course, the communities that share these spaces. Every tiger needs a healthy forest, and every healthy forest can support thousands of species. And these forests secure rivers, they store carbon, they regulate climate, support millions of people who depend on them. So, as we move forward, the future of tiger conservation actually depends on our ability to build connected landscapes, strengthen human wildlife coexistence, and work across various sectors and communities. So, thank you so much, Deepthi, Meghna, and Shreya, for sharing your insights. And again, for reminding us that conservation is as much about us as it is about wildlife. And thank you, viewers, for tuning in. Please follow Nature Speaks on WWF India YouTube channel for more conservation stories exploring people and nature. Thank you.